Morning light spreads slowly across the ridgeline. The air is heavy, warm, still, somewhere in the Pacific. In the later years of the war, jungle mist clings to broken ground, scarred by weeks of fighting. American artillery crews are already awake. Hands move quietly over steel britches and elevation wheels. Men speak in measured tones, reading coordinates from damp maps, numbers written in pencil and smudged by sweat. Ahead of them lies a narrow stretch of terrain, ravines, tree lines. Shallow depressions, ground that has swallowed entire units before. Across that ground, a Japanese infantry battalion is moving, exhausted, dug in or advancing by doctrine that leaves little room to maneuver. They are trained to endure, to hold, to close with the enemy, but artillery does not fight face to face. A forward observer adjusts his binoculars. A radio crackles. Wind, distance, elevation calculated, corrected, confirmed. The guns are silent for a final second that seems longer than it should. Then a command is given, and steel begins to rise into the sky. The first shell has not yet landed, but the moment has already passed beyond recovery, carrying the battlefield toward a point where survival will depend on more than courage alone. By the time American artillery was capable of destroying an entire Japanese battalion in a single coordinated fire mission, the Pacific War had already burned away every illusion of speed or simplicity. The conflict that erupted after December 7, 1941, expanded across an ocean larger than all previous battlefields combined. What began as rapid Japanese offensives through the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and into the Central Pacific had, by 1943 and 1944, hardened into a grinding war of attrition. Islands that had once been dots on a map became names etched into casualty lists. For Japan, the strategic situation was deteriorating. Industrial output could not match American production. Fuel shortages constrained naval and air operations. Replacement troops arrived with less training and fewer heavy weapons. Yet Japanese doctrine did not adapt easily. Infantry formations were expected to hold ground, absorb punishment, and fight tough death if necessary. Withdrawal was rarely considered an option. For the United States, the opposite was taking place. American forces were learning, adapting, standardizing. The U.S. Army's artillery arm, in particular, was undergoing a quiet revolution. Early frustrations, poor coordination, inadequate forward observation, slow communication were studied and corrected. By mid-war, American artillery doctrine emphasized centralized fire control, rapid massing of guns, and flexible targeting. A battalion could call for the firepower of an entire division if the situation demanded it. This was not accidental. It was systemic. Artillery officers were trained to think in terms of terrain denial rather than enemy destruction alone. Maps were studied not just for roads and elevations, but for likely avenues of movement, choke points, and fallback positions. Jungle, hills, and ravines, once shields for defenders, became reference points for pre-registered fire. Japanese infantry units, meanwhile, often found themselves trapped by the very ground they were ordered to defend. Thick vegetation limited visibility. Steep slopes restricted maneuver. Defensive positions were dug deep, camouflaged well, and often interconnected by tunnels or trenches, but these features were designed to resist infantry assaults, not sustained artillery saturation. The battalion as a unit remained central to Japanese ground warfare. Roughly 800 to 1,000 men, organized into rifle companies, machine gun sections, and light mortar teams. It were intended to fight as a cohesive body. Firepower was limited. Heavy artillery support was rare. Communications relied on runners and field telephones that were easily severed. Once committed, a battalion was expected to endure whatever came. American planners understood this. Intelligence reports, captured documents, and battlefield experience had revealed a pattern. Japanese units would hold positions far longer than Western doctrine anticipated. They would absorb losses that would break other formations. But when overwhelmed, when communications collapsed, and leadership was neutralized, the disintegration could be sudden and catastrophic. Artillery was the tool that exploited this vulnerability. By the later stages of the Pacific War, American fire missions were no longer brief preparatory barrages. They were calculated, sustained, and adaptive. Forward observers worked alongside infantry units, adjusting fire in real time. Batteries fired in sequence, overlapping impacts to prevent escape or reorganization. Terrain was boxed in. Movement became impossible. The engagement, implied by this title, where a Japanese battalion was effectively destroyed by artillery fire, was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of two opposing systems colliding, one built on endurance and sacrifice, the other on coordination and overwhelming firepower, and that collision would take place in a very specific setting, shaped by geography, command decisions, and the slow narrowing of options on both sides. Those conditions did not appear overnight. They were the result of weeks, sometimes months of pressure, preparation, and positioning, leading both forces toward the same piece of ground. The ground where this battalion would be destroyed was not chosen by chance. Like many engagements in the Pacific, it emerged from a tightening operational vice rather than a single dramatic maneuver. American forces were advancing methodically, clearing terrain that had been bypassed, isolating Japanese units left without resupply or reinforcement. By this stage of the war, U.S. operations followed a pattern refined through hard experience. Infantry pushed forward cautiously. Engineers cleared paths and improved supply routes. Artillery units moved up behind them, hauling guns through mud, over coral, or along narrow jungle tracks hacked out by hand. Each advance was slow, deliberate, and designed to minimize exposure. The Japanese battalion in question had likely been ordered to hold a sector, considered vital, perhaps a ridgeline overlooking a supply route, a valley controlling movement inland, or a defensive line intended to delay American progress. Such orders were rarely accompanied by promises of relief. Communications with higher headquarters were often sporadic. Air cover was minimal or non-existent. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Yet the expectation remained absolute. The position would be held. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized concealment and close engagement. Positions were dug to avoid aerial observation. Heavy foliage was left intact. Fields of fire were limited but deadly at close range. Mortar were carefully sighted. Machine guns were positioned to enfilade likely approaches. In theory, this would force American infantry into costly frontal assaults. But American doctrine had changed. Rather than rushing these positions, U.S. commanders increasingly chose to fix the enemy in place and destroy them with fire. Artillery was not merely preparatory, it became the main effort. Infantry advances were timed to exploit the effects of bombardment, not precede it. Key to this approach was intelligence and observation. Patrols identified likely battalion positions. Aerial photographs, though imperfect in jungle terrain, revealed patterns, unnatural clearings, disturbed soil, supply dumps. Captured prisoners, when available, provided unit identifications and rough strength estimates. Even the sound of movement at night helped confirm locations, once a battalion's presence was confirmed. American planners could shape the battlefield. Pre-registered artillery targets were established across escape routes, rear areas, and suspected reserve positions. Fire plans were layered, allowing for rapid shifts in focus. If the enemy attempted to withdraw, shells would fall behind them. If they tried to counterattack, barrages would descend ahead of their movement. For the Japanese battalion, options narrowed with each passing day. Terrain that once offered concealment became confinement. Defensive works could protect against small arms and grenades, but not against repeated high-explosive impacts. Tunnels collapsed. Trees shattered into lethal splinters. Trenches filled with debris and water. Leadership under these conditions faced impossible choices. To remain was to endure mounting losses. To withdraw without orders risked dishonor and often execution if survival allowed a report to be made. Communications, already fragile, deteriorated further as lines were cut and radios destroyed. American artillery units, by contrast, operated within a system designed for endurance. Guns could be resupplied. Crews rotated. Fire missions were logged, analyzed, and refined. The process was impersonal, methodical, and relentless. This imbalance was not born of cruelty. It was the logic of industrial warfare applied to terrain that magnified its effects. Steel and explosives could be delivered faster than men could move, dig, or recover. As pressure mounted, the Japanese battalion became increasingly static. Movement was limited to night. Casualties accumulated. Morale eroded not in panic, but in exhaustion. The conditions were set. The units were in place. The calculations were complete. What remained was the moment when observation became action, when coordinates turned into trajectories, and the abstract geometry of a fire plan translated into destruction on the ground. That moment would be examined from multiple perspectives, each revealing a different truth about what it meant to fight, command, and endure under artillery fire. For the men serving the guns, the battlefield was rarely visible. They did not see the enemy's faces. They saw numbers, bearings, elevations. Their war was measured in seconds and meters. Artillery crews lived in a world of routine. Load, ram, lock, fire. Each movement was drilled until it became automatic. In the Pacific, this routine unfolded under punishing conditions: heat that warped metal, humidity that soaked powder bags, insects that swarmed over everything that stood still. Yet discipline mattered. A misread coordinate or miscalculated charge could send a shell wide, endangering friendly troops. Accuracy was not just professionalism. It was survival. By the time of this engagement, American artillery units had learned to work as a network. Forward observers, often embedded with infantry companies, identified targets and relayed corrections. Fire direction centers plotted data and coordinated multiple batteries. The guns themselves, whether 105 mm howitzers or heavier pieces, could deliver sustained fire with frightening consistency. The men firing those guns understood the effect of their work in abstract terms. They knew what high-explosive shells did to trenches and tree lines. They had seen the aftermath before. But in the moment, there was no room for reflection. Orders came in. Adjustments were made. The next round was loaded. For many, the destruction of an enemy battalion would not be felt as a dramatic victory. It would register as the successful execution of a fire mission. Targets neutralized. Resistance reduced, infantry able to advance. Only later, when infantry reports came back, would the scale of the outcome become clear. Asterisk on the receiving end. The experience could not have been more different. Japanese infantrymen were trained to expect hardship. Food shortages, disease, isolation. These were accepted as part of service. Artillery, however, represented a threat that could not be met with courage or skill alone. When the first shells began to fall, the battalion's defensive system was tested immediately. Dugouts provided some protection, but repeated impacts collapsed roofs and filled enclosed spaces with smoke and dust. Communications broke down. Runners attempting to relay orders were cut down or buried. Movement became perilous. A man leaving cover risked being caught by fragments or falling trees. Entire squads could be incapacitated without ever seeing the enemy. Officers struggled to maintain control, shouting commands that went unheard over the concussions. The battalion's cohesion, its ability to act as a single unit, began to erode. Companies became isolated. Platoons were reduced to clusters of survivors clinging to whatever cover remained. Yet resistance did not simply cease. Some positions continued to fire blindly, machine guns rattling from shattered emplacements. Mortar teams attempted to respond, only to be silenced as their positions were identified and targeted. For the individual soldier, time distorted. Minutes felt endless. There was no clear front, no direction of safety. Only the next explosion, and the next. The ground itself played a decisive role. What had once been considered ideal, defensive terrain now amplified the artillery's effect. Ravines trapped blast waves. Dense jungle turned fragments into unpredictable, lethal projectiles. Slopes prevented rapid movement, forcing men to remain where they were as fire adjusted onto their positions. Defensive works, carefully constructed over weeks, became liabilities. Trenches filled with debris. Tunnels collapsed under repeated shockwaves. Cover that could not be abandoned became a tomb. American planners understood this interaction between terrain and firepower. Barrages were not random. They were designed to exploit the landscape, to seal exits, to funnel movement, to deny shelter. The battalion was not merely under fire. It was contained by it. And as the bombardment continued, the engagement moved beyond questions of endurance or discipline. It became a test of command decisions and doctrine, of how leaders on both sides responded when control slipped away, and survival depended on choices made under crushing pressure. Those decisions would shape what happened next. For commanders on both sides, artillery changed the nature of leadership. Decisions were made with incomplete information, often delayed by minutes or hours. The difference lay in how each system absorbed that uncertainty. American command structures were designed for flexibility. If a forward observer lost contact, another could take over. If a battery was forced to relocate, fire missions could be reassigned. Authority was distributed, yet coordinated through doctrine and communication. In this engagement, American officers did not need to see the enemy battalion directly. They trusted the system. Fire plans had been prepared in advance. Contingencies accounted for likely reactions: withdrawal, counterattack, concealment. When adjustments were needed, they were made calmly, methodically. Japanese command faced a harsher reality. Battalion and company commanders were physically close to the fight, often sharing the same vulnerability as their men. When communications failed, leadership became local and fragmented. Orders could not be disseminated. Coordination between companies ceased. In some cases, officers attempted to move between positions to reassert control. Many were killed in the attempt. Others found units so reduced that command itself became symbolic. Leadership, under sustained artillery fire, was no longer about maneuver. It was about endurance, about maintaining purpose in conditions where purpose had little practical effect. This engagement was not merely a clash of units. It was a collision between doctrines shaped by different assumptions. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized decisive close combat. Victory was expected to come through determination, sacrifice, and the moral superiority of the soldier. Firepower was secondary. Artillery support, when available, was limited and often static. American doctrine, by contrast, treated infantry as one element of a combined system. Firepower was central. Artillery was used not just to weaken the enemy, but to shape the battlefield before infantry ever closed in. In this moment, the disparity was decisive. Japanese soldiers could not reach the American lines. They could not maneuver to flank the guns. Their doctrine offered no solution to sustained, accurately adjusted artillery fire. What had once been a strength refusal to withdraw became a fatal constraint, beyond physical destruction. Artillery imposed a psychological burden that few could withstand. For American troops, artillery offered reassurance. The knowledge that fire could be called down provided a sense of control, even in hostile terrain. Infantrymen advanced knowing that resistance could be neutralized from a distance. For Japanese soldiers, the effect was the opposite. Artillery was impersonal, unpredictable, and overwhelming. There was no visible enemy to confront. No moment of individual bravery that could change the outcome. Survivors later described the sense of being hunted by an unseen force, of waiting for death without the ability to act. Morale did not collapse in panic, but it eroded steadily, worn down by exhaustion and inevitability. By the time the barrage reached its most intense phase, the battalion was no longer a cohesive fighting unit. It was a collection of isolated groups and individuals, each enduring the same reality alone. At this point, the engagement moved beyond preparation and perspective. The calculations had been made. The angles had converged. What followed was the decisive moment, the sustained fire that transformed pressure into annihilation, and a battalion into a line in an after-action report. The fire mission did not begin with chaos. It began with confirmation. Coordinates were checked one final time. Elevation adjusted by fractions of a degree. Wind data relayed from forward observation posts. The process was deliberate, almost quiet. Then the order was given. The first salvo was not intended to destroy. It was meant to find. Shells landed short, then long, walking across the target area in controlled increments. Observers watched for impact flashes through gaps in foliage, adjusting fire with clipped radio transmissions. When the range was correct, the tone changed. Guns across multiple batteries opened in sequence, then together. The rhythm tightened. The sky filled with the low rolling sound of shells in flight, an approach that could be heard seconds before impact, but not avoided. High explosive rounds detonated across the battalion's positions. Trees shattered. Earth heaved. Trenches collapsed inward. The concussions overlapped, leaving no pause long enough to recover or reorganize. Japanese defensive positions responded as doctrine demanded. Machine guns fired blindly toward suspected American lines. Mortar launched hurried rounds that fell wide or were cut short as crews were killed or forced to abandon their tubes. Small arms fire crackled intermittently, then faded. As fire intensified, artillery shifted from area coverage to deliberate saturation. Suspected command posts were targeted. Ravines that might allow movement were shelled continuously. Rear areas once thought safe became killing zones. Forward observers adjusted fire almost constantly. A burst of movement in one sector brought immediate response. A lull elsewhere prompted a shift. The battlefield became a grid of impact zones, each one feeding into the next. Within the Japanese battalion, structure dissolved. Company boundaries ceased to exist. Orders, when given, could not be carried out. Men attempted to move deeper into cover, only to find it already destroyed. Some tried to break through the bombardment, hoping to escape into adjacent terrain. Few succeeded. Leadership losses mounted. Officers and non-commissioned officers, identifiable by position and movement, were especially vulnerable. With each loss, resistance became more localized, more desperate. The barrage did not relent. Ammunition stocks on the American side were sufficient for hours of sustained fire. Crews rotated. Barrels overheated and were cooled. The system absorbed the strain. For those under fire, there was no such relief. Time lost meaning. There was no clear beginning or end to each impact, only a continuous assault that crushed both body and will. Survivors later described the ground itself as alive, rising and falling beneath them. At a certain point, the battalion's ability to function as a military unit ended. There was no formal surrender, no signal of defeat, only silence where organized resistance had once existed. Yet the artillery did not stop. Immediately. American doctrine required confirmation. Fire was maintained to prevent regrouping, to ensure that no pockets of resistance remained capable of counterattack. The last shells fell not in anger, but in caution. when the guns finally lifted. The landscape had been transformed, and what American infantry would find as they advanced into the shattered terrain would confirm that this was not merely a successful engagement, but the destruction of a battalion as a fighting force. When the artillery fire lifted, the silence was immediate and unnatural. American infantry units moved forward cautiously, stepping into ground that no longer resembled a defensive position. The terrain had been pulverized. Trees lay snapped at mid-trunk. Trenches were flattened into shallow scars. What had once been dense jungle cover was stripped open, exposing everything beneath it. There was no coordinated resistance. Isolated shots rang out briefly, single rifles fired by survivors acting on instinct rather than orders. These were quickly silenced. Most Japanese soldiers were already dead or incapacitated. Others were too wounded, too stunned, or too buried to respond. Infantrymen advanced in small teams, clearing positions methodically. Dugouts were opened and searched. Some contained bodies stacked by collapse. Others revealed men still alive, disoriented, deafened, unable to fight. The destruction was not theatrical. It was total. Reports moved back up the American chain of command with measured language. Enemy resistance neutralized. Area secured. Heavy casualties inflicted. The words did not convey scale, but the implication was clear. An entire battalion had ceased to exist as an effective unit. The absence of enemy fire was as telling as its earlier intensity. No counterattack followed. No organized withdrawal. Communications intercepts confirmed nothing moving behind the line. What had been identified as a battalion sector was now silent. From a doctrinal perspective, the operation had unfolded exactly as intended. Artillery had fixed and destroyed the enemy. Infantry had advanced only when resistance had collapsed. Casualties on the American side were minimal compared to earlier engagements where such positions were assaulted directly, yet the battlefield itself told a heavier story. Japanese dead lay where they had been fighting, or attempting to escape, or sheltering. There was no single line of bodies, only a wide, uneven spread across the terrain. Evidence of how thoroughly the fire had saturated every possible refuge. Medical personnel moved among the wounded, offering aid where possible. Prisoners were few. Most survivors were beyond resistance rather than willing to surrender. The psychological and physical toll of the bombardment had stripped away any remaining capacity for combat. For American soldiers, the aftermath produced conflicting emotions. Relief was immediate. The knowledge that a deadly position had been eliminated without a costly assault mattered deeply. But there was also a subdued recognition of what artillery had accomplished: destruction at a scale few infantrymen ever witnessed directly. Officers walked the ground with maps in hand, comparing pre-fire estimates with reality. Positions identified as probable command posts were obliterated. Escape routes had been effectively sealed. The fire plan had worked with clinical precision. For the Japanese command structure, if any messages reached higher headquarters at all, they came too late to alter the outcome. A battalion had been committed, held in place, and destroyed. There would be no relief force. No countersdrok. This moment marked more than the end of a single unit. It reinforced a pattern that would repeat across the Pacific. Artillery, when properly coordinated, could achieve what frontal assaults could not. It could annihilate resistance while preserving American lives. And as news of the engagement filtered through operational channels, it shaped decisions that extended far beyond this patch of shattered ground. Decisions that would influence how future battles were fought, and how the war itself would be brought to its conclusion. Those consequences would become clear in the days and weeks that followed. In the hours following the engagement, the battlefield was secured and documented with the same methodical discipline that had defined the artillery fire itself. American units established perimeter defenses, anticipating a counterattack that never came. Patrols pushed outward, confirming what the silence already suggested. There was no organized enemy force left in the sector. Casualty assessments began almost immediately. For the Japanese battalion, losses were catastrophic, while exact numbers would vary depending on terrain and recovery. After-action reports consistently described the unit as destroyed or eliminated. This did not imply the death of every individual, but the loss of cohesion, command structure, and combat capability. A battalion that could no longer maneuver, communicate, or resist effectively no longer existed in military terms. American casualties were comparatively light. This contrast was not overlooked by commanders. It validated the decision to rely on firepower rather than direct assault. Earlier in the war, similar positions had been taken at enormous cost. Now the balance had shifted. The physical damage was surveyed in detail. Crater patterns showed overlapping fire zones. Defensive works were mapped and compared to pre-engagement intelligence. The analysis confirmed that artillery saturation, not isolated strikes, had been decisive. No single shell destroyed the battalion. The cumulative effect did. For Japanese survivors, the aftermath was one of disorientation and exhaustion. Those capable of movement were gathered and secured. Many were wounded beyond immediate recovery. Others were suffering from shock, dehydration, and trauma that left them unresponsive. The resistance that Japanese doctrine prized had been rendered irrelevant by conditions that offered no opportunity for individual valor to change the outcome. American medics and infantrymen encountered scenes they would remember long after the war, not because of brutality in combat, but because of its impersonal scale. Artillery had erased positions rather than overrun them. The destruction felt absolute. Reports moved upward through American command channels, informing operational planning. The elimination of a battalion opened routes previously denied. It reduced the need for additional forces in that sector. It freed artillery units to be reassigned to the next phase of operations. The engagement also fed into a growing body of data. Artillery effectiveness was measured, not assumed. Ammunition expenditure was logged. Observer accuracy was evaluated. Each battle refined the system further. On the Japanese side, the loss added to an already dire strategic picture. Units were being committed piecemeal, often without sufficient support. The expectation of holding ground at all costs resulted in formations being fixed in place and destroyed rather than preserved for future defense, yet this reality was slow to penetrate. Higher levels of Japanese command. Reports, when they arrived, were often incomplete. Communications breakdowns and the chaos of retreat obscured the true scale of losses. What could not be obscured was the cumulative effect. Each destroyed battalion reduced Japan's ability to contest American advances. Each engagement shifted the psychological balance, reinforcing the sense of inevitability that would haunt Japanese forces in the final year of the war. The destruction of this battalion was not decisive by itself, but it was part of a pattern, a clear demonstration of how the war in the Pacific had evolved, and why its end would not come through sudden collapse, but through relentless, methodical pressure. That pressure would reshape strategies on both sides as the war moved forward.
In the weeks that followed, the consequences of the engagement extended beyond the immediate battlefield. American operational planners adjusted timelines with new confidence. Positions once considered obstacles were now treated as problems of coordination rather than courage. Artillery was no longer simply support, it was the primary means by which resistance would be broken. Unit histories written after the war would note this engagement in restrained language. There were no dramatic flourishes, no emphasis on heroics. The language was technical. Fire missions executed as planned. Enemy forces neutralized. objectives secured. Yet behind those phrases lay a profound shift in how battles were fought. For American forces, the destruction of a Japanese battalion by artillery reinforced an emerging belief that industrial-scale firepower, properly directed, could decide battles without the need for frontal assaults. This belief shaped operations in later campaigns, where preparatory and sustained bombardments became routine before infantry advances. Artillery units gained increased priority in logistics and planning. Ammunition stockpiles were expanded. Observer training intensified. Communications equipment was improved. Each lesson was absorbed quickly, often while the war was still being fought. For Japanese forces, the implications were grim. The loss of a battalion was not merely a tactical setback. It represented an irreplaceable drain on manpower, leadership, and morale. Replacement troops arrived with less experience. Heavy weapons were scarce. Artillery support remained limited and vulnerable to American counter-battery fire. Defensive doctrine, rooted in endurance and sacrifice, proved increasingly ineffective against an enemy that could deliver overwhelming force from a distance. Attempts to adapt, deeper fortifications, dispersed positions, offered limited relief. Artillery could still reach them. It could still saturate terrain until no position remained viable. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Survivors carried with them an understanding that some battles could not be won through bravery alone. The sense of being hunted by unseen guns eroded morale long before contact with American infantry occurred. At higher levels of command, Japanese leaders faced an impossible dilemma. To withdraw risked abandoning ground and inviting defeat. To hold invited destruction. Without the industrial capacity to match American firepower, each choice led to the same outcome: attrition without relief. The engagement also contributed to a growing realization among American commanders that the war would be won not through singular decisive battles, but through accumulation, battalion by battalion, position by position. The destruction of one unit mattered because it could not be replaced. As American forces continued their advance, similar engagements followed. Artillery isolated and destroyed enemy formations. Infantry moved forward through landscapes reshaped by fire. The pattern repeated with grim consistency. By the final year of the war, this approach would culminate in battles of unprecedented scale, where artillery fire reached levels unimaginable at the war's outset. But the principles were already in place, refined through engagements like this one. The battalion destroyed here did not alter the course of the war on its own, but it illustrated with stark clarity how the balance of power had shifted and how the end of the conflict would be achieved not through sudden collapse, but through sustained, overwhelming force applied with precision. That understanding would shape not only the remainder of the war, but the way future conflicts were planned and fought. In the quiet that follows artillery fire, the battlefield feels larger than it did before. Not because it has expanded, but because what once filled it is gone. The destruction of a Japanese battalion by American artillery was not an act of spectacle. It was the outcome of systems colliding. Doctrine against doctrine, endurance against industry, human will against calculated force. No single moment defined it. No heroic charge or dramatic surrender marked its end. Instead, it ended the way modern warfare often does, through accumulation, precision, and inevitability. For the soldiers who fired the guns, the engagement became another entry in a logbook. Coordinates, rounds expended, mission complete. For the infantry who advanced afterward, it became a memory of silence where resistance had been expected. For the Japanese soldiers who endured it, it was an experience that stripped war of any illusion of control. This moment revealed a truth that would define the remainder of the Second World War.
Courage alone could not overcome firepower on this scale. Discipline alone could not endure it indefinitely. The battlefield had become a place where survival depended less on proximity to the enemy and more on whether one could be seen, fixed, and targeted. Artillery did not hate, it did not judge. It acted on numbers and commands, reshaping terrain and fate with equal indifference. In doing so, it reduced human struggle to geometry and timing. Yet behind every calculation were men, those who gave the orders, those who executed them, and those who suffered their effects. The destruction of a battalion was not just a military outcome, it was hundreds of lives erased from the future, their absence felt long after the ground was reclaimed by jungle and silence. In the broader history of the war, this engagement stands as one of many. But taken together, such moments explain how the conflict was decided, not in sudden collapse, but in the steady application of force until resistance could no longer exist. When the guns fell silent, the war moved on. The ground remained, and the lesson endured.